Hi there, this is Thomas Brett for the Pro Audiophiles and thomasbrettmixing.com. In this video, I'd like to talk to you about one of my favourite mixing engineers, and probably one of your favourite mixing engineers, Chris Lord-Alge, also known as CLA. When I was first starting out in mixing around 10 years ago, I was watching a lot of tutorials on YouTube and reading a lot of guides on the internet, and a name that I was coming across constantly was Chris Lord-Alge. After doing a little bit of research, I realised that Chris was the guy responsible for the sounds of a lot of my favourite records growing up. We're talking about huge hit records such as Green Day's American Idiot, My Chemical Romance's The Black Parade, Paramore's Brand New Eyes, 3 Days Grace's 1X, Nickelback's Here and Now, and Hailstorm's first album, which made them huge stars. Back then, when I was watching these tutorials by Chris, I was kind of looking at things the wrong way. I would try to copy the exact EQ settings or compression settings that he was using on a vocal or a guitar, and it never really worked out for me. After rewatching a lot of Chris's tutorials again recently, almost 10 years later, I realised that it's the concepts and his general approach that is more valuable than the actual settings he's using. On that note, today I'd like to share with you 5 major mixing lessons that I've learned from studying CLA. The first lesson that I'd like to share with you is calibrating your ears before starting a mix. Now, what do I mean by calibrating your ears? When you first walk into the studio in the morning and you open up the raw tracks for the song that you're going to be mixing that day in your DAW, the kick might sound like it has a lot of low end, or the vocal might sound clear and bright in solo. The problem here is that you don't have an accurate point of reference for what low end should sound like or what brightness should sound like. To combat this, a lot of mixing engineers will start their day by listening to some of their favourite reference mixes in order to acclimatise their ears to what good low end and good high end actually sounds like. The second you compare your raw tracks to a fully polished, mixed and mastered reference track, you'll start to notice just how dull and lifeless your raw tracks are in comparison. Another incredible technique that I learned from watching CLA is that when he's EQing something, he starts by cranking the high end and cranking the low end. When you start by really cranking the high end and low end on a raw track, as you bring it back to unity, you'll instantly notice just how lifeless the track starts to sound. At that point, it becomes a lot easier to find a good middle ground for where your highs and lows should be set. While before I started using this technique, when mixing a vocal, I might try a 1 dB boost, then a 2 dB boost, then maybe a 4 dB boost at 8 kHz, and you're kind of just guessing as to how bright the vocal should be. When using this CLA trick, I'm really just cranking the high end from the get-go to get a better understanding of what bright actually sounds like. It instantly just becomes a lot easier to judge the high end. I find that by doing this, I'm able to get a vocal sound that I'm happy with much quicker than before. Although it might sound like a really simple thing, I'd highly recommend that you try it out on your next mix. The next lesson that I learned from CLA is the importance of using presets. Now, at this point you may be thinking, well, doesn't Chris Lord-Alge mix on an analog board and barely use any plugins at all? Sure, he's an analog guy, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't use presets. What is a preset? A preset basically means something that has been pre-set, something that is ready to go without you having to tweak it at all. In that sense of the word, yeah, CLA definitely uses presets. If you've ever seen any pictures or videos of him working in his studio, you'll notice the huge amount of analog gear that he has sitting behind him. The really interesting thing about all this analog gear is that most of the time he never touches it and just leaves it as is. His Blue 1176 compressor, for example, which he uses on a lot of his lead vocals, he'll never go back and tweak the attack or release or threshold settings on the compressor. If he wants more compression, he'll simply send more vocals to it from the desk. I guess the main point that I'm trying to get across here is that we often really overthink this stuff. We'll spend hours tweaking the attack time or release time on a vocal when it's not really making that much of a difference, and if you just cranked it and made it sound exciting, you'd probably get better results anyway. The third CLA lesson that I'd like to share with you, on a similar note, is that he definitely has some favourite frequencies. A lot of the time when he's mixing, he'll stick to the EQs that are built into his SSL console. He won't really go back and tweak a lot of additional EQ. On vocals, for example, he absolutely loves 8 kHz, 4.5K, and 2.5K, and is usually boosting a combination of these 3 frequencies to get his vocals to sound really present and upfront. While these frequencies that he's choosing might change slightly from mix to mix. For example, he might use 10K instead of 8K, or 4K instead of 4.5K. Generally speaking, he's kind of keeping them preset on his console, so that when he's mixing a vocal, all he really has to do is boost, boost, and then boost, and blend the 3 to taste until he's happy with his vocal sound. And what I've just talked about leads us into the next CLA lesson, the fact that he's primarily using Additive EQ, and barely ever cuts anything, apart from maybe a bit of low end. The thing that I find really interesting about this is that in modern mixing, we seem to be really obsessed with subtractive EQ. In fact, on the internet, I'll often come across people talking about how it's wrong to add EQ or boost EQ and how the correct studio way of EQing is to cut frequencies. Well, from watching CLA, he barely cuts anything. On a vocal or a guitar, he might just boost high end. And when I say boost, I mean crank. Think of it this way. You can actually achieve the same results with boosting and cutting if you know what you're doing. If you really scoop out the mids from an electric guitar, you're essentially accentuating the highs and the lows. Whereas if you boost the highs and lows on a guitar, you're effectively scooping out the mids. The primary difference here, in my opinion, is that it's a lot easier to hear boosts than it is to hear cuts. So imagine this scenario. You start mixing with a heavily subtractive mentality. You go in and you start cutting out individual frequencies with hundreds of bands of EQ. The problem here is that when you're working in such finite detail, you might spend a lot of time trying to get to that end result, kind of skewing your ears in the process, and meaning you lose perspective after a while, and can end up overdoing things and really neutering the sound of the instrument. When you're working primarily additive, on the other hand, and you're boosting high end and boosting low end, and effectively turning down the mids, you're turning them down much more musically. You're turning them all down effectively by the same amount, maintaining the character of that instrument and the way that it was recorded into the microphone. And this leads us into our final CLA lesson: excitement over perfection. A lot of the time in modern mixing, we're striving for perfection. Everything is edited, everything is auto-tuned, every single ringing frequency is notched out with a tight EQ band, and in general, we're aiming for everything to be pristine. But with CLA, he really doesn't approach mixing in that kind of a mentality, and his main goal is always to emphasize the excitement of the song. Listening back to a lot of the albums that I mentioned earlier, these mega hits that CLA's mixed for all these amazing rock bands, something that really stood out to me was the fact that I can hear a lot of ringy frequencies, a lot of frequencies that nowadays a lot of people would just remove. But thinking back to when I was a teenager, I never heard the flaws in these albums. All I remember is hearing amazing, exciting rock songs that you could play anywhere and they'd sound great, and they'd make you want to go and buy that album. So when you start a mix with the end goal of making it exciting and compelling for the end listener, and not with the goal of making it pristine and perfect, chances are you'll end up with a mix that is a lot more appealing to listen to. At the end of the day, we don't do this job to appeal to the OCD of our peers, to other engineers. We do this to make exciting, great music that is going to sell and be successful, that the end listener is going to want to listen to. So if I was to sum up everything I've learned from CLA under a single banner, it would be excitement over perfection. He barely ever does any surgical EQ. He's primarily thinking additive and broad. He's really accentuating the exciting parts, the high end and the low end. He's not overthinking his compression settings. He's not going back and tweaking his attack, release and threshold for every single song that he mixes. He's just setting them and pushing it harder when he needs more compression. And he's starting out by giving himself an accurate point of reference for what bright and what dark sounds like by really cranking his EQ and then bringing things back. Cool. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. I know that through starting to use some of these techniques in my own mixes, I've really improved, even 10 years into my career. This has been Thomas Brett for the Pro Audio Files and thomasbrettmixing.com. Hoping to see you in the next video. Cheers.